Sir, good afternoon. My name is Jolian Biglarma from BSA1. So today we'll be discussing about PFRS 7, Financial Instruments Disclosure. So we have here learning objects. State two main categories of disclosure under PFRS 7 and state the types of risk required by PFRS to be disclosed. Dito po malalaman natin kung ano po yung dalawang pinaka-main po nila sa disclosure po. And sa pangalawa po, ito yung mga malalaman natin kung ano yung mga risk po na dinadala po ni PFRS para sa disclose na po. Introduction. PFRS 7 prescribes the disclosure requirements for financial instruments. The disclosures are broadly classified into the following two main categories. A. Significance of financial instruments to the entity's financial position and performance. And B. The nature and extent of risk arising from financial statements to be which the entity is exposed and how the entity manages those risks. So, significance of financial instruments. Statement of financial position. Number 1. Carrying amounts of financial assets and financial liabilities. An entity is required to disclose the carrying amounts of each of the following categories of financial instruments under PFRS 9. So, dito po sa number 1, yung under po ng PFRS 9 na kung ano po yung dinadala niya pong mga amounts, kailangan po yun na ma-disclose. Under po ng A, financial assets measured at fair value through profit or loss, FVPL, showing separately those that are designated and those that are mandatorily measured at FPL. So, dito po sa letter A, dito po dapat kailangan may fair value po siya. True profit and loss po talaga. Kailangan po dun sa designated and yung mandatorily measure at FBL. Kailangan po talaga na under po siya ng fair value through profit or loss. Kailangan po na designated and mandatorily measure po nila. Next po. We have B, financial assets measured at amortized cost. So, sa amortized cost po, under po din siya ng financial assets po. Letter C, financial assets measure a fair value through other comprehensive income, FVOCI, showing separately those are mandatorily classified as such and those that are elected to be classified as such. So dito po sa letter C po, ang financial assets po nila ay nami-measure po through fair value through other comprehensive income po nila. Yun nga po, under din po nila, kailangan po na mandatorily tsaka elected to be classified as such. D, financial liabilities at amortized cost. So, meron din po amortized cost sa financial liabilities. E, financial liabilities at fair value through profit or loss, showing separately those that are designated and those that are meet the definition of held for trading. So, dito po sa financial liabilities, para sa fair value through profit and loss, kailangan po na yung measure po nila is designated at namimit po yung definition nila sa held for trading. Letter E, financial liabilities at fair value through profit or loss, showing separately those that are designated and those that meet the definition. Naulit po. Number 2 na po tayo. Financial assets and financial liabilities measured at FBL. If an entity designated financial assets to be measured at FAL, it shall disclose the financial asset exposure to credit risk and the change in the fair value attribute to changes in credit risk. So, dito po sa pagme-measure po ng financial asset at financial liabilities sa FVL, kailangan po na ma-disclose po yung exposure niya para hindi po ma-risk tsaka ma-change po yung value po nila. Next po, if an entity designated a financial liability to be measured at FPL, it shall disclose the change in fair value that is attributed changes in credit risk, the difference between the carrying amount and maturity value, and if the entity is required to present the effects of changes in the liability credit risk in OCI, any cumulative gain or loss that were transferred between equity or were realized. So, dito na po, papasok na po, ay marami pong ibig sabihin na po yung carrying amount and maturity value. So, marami pa po yan. Number 3 po, financial assets measured at FVOCI. If an entity elected to measure investments in equity securities at FVOCI, it shall disclose those investments, the reasons for the election, and if dividends recognized during the period, and any transfers of cumulative gain or loss within equity. So, dito po sa number 3, para daw po ma-elect po ang mga measures, investments po nila, tsaka yung mga securities, kailangan po ma-disclose po yung mga investments po nila. The main reason po para sa election po, na kailangan po nila ma-recognize during the period na may sorry po for the internet connection po, may pagka troubleshooting po. So as I continue po, kailangan po talaga, yun nga po, yung kailangan po na i-elect yung measure investment po. Kailangan po yung malaman po, pati yung securities at FVOCI, kailangan po talaga na i-disclose yung investments na po yun. Why? The main reason of the election na kung ano po yung may define nila yun during the period po, kailangan nila transfers of cumulative gain or loss within equity. If any of those investments were disposed of, the entity shall disclose the reason for disposal, the fair value on the recognition date, and the cumulative gain or loss on disposal. So, isa or alin man doon na investment na yun, kung nawala po man, yung entity niya na po, madi-disclose po yun for the main reason of disposal. So, the fair value on recognition date and the communicating on this. So, yun po, isasali na po nila ang fair value po nila na mismo i-assume nila sa date na yun at saka sa cumulative gain or loss on disposal po niya. Number 4, reclassification. If an entity has reclassified financial assets, it shall disclose the date of reclassification, an explanation of the change in business model, and the amount reclassified between categories. So, dito po sa number 4, reclassification, kailangan po natin i-classify yung mga financial asset. Kailangan po natin ulitin kasi po, madi-disclose na po nila yung mga date of reclassification. An explanation naman po niya dahil po sa pagbabago-bago po ng isang modelo ng business po. At saka sa amount po nila under po sa anuman categories po nila. Next po. Number 5, offsetting financial assets and financial liabilities. If an entity has offset financial assets and financial liabilities, it shall disclose the gross amounts of those assets and liabilities, the amounts that were set off, the net amounts presented in the statement of financial position, and description of the related legal right of set off. So, dito po sa offsetting po sa financial assets and financial liabilities, na kung ano po yung nakuha nyo pong amount, kung ano po yung mga kung ano po yung mga amounts na under bawat categories po nila, kailangan po yung magsara at kailangan po yung ma-offset. Kumbaga po, kung ano po yung na-compute nyo po na amount po, yun yung magiging offset nyo po. At yun din po yung ipapresent nyo po in the statement of financial position and description of the related legal right of set-off. So, number 6, collateral. An entity shall disclose the carrying amounts of financial assets pledged as collateral for liabilities, including terms and conditions of the pledge. If the entity holds a collateral that is permitted to sell or repledge, the entity shall disclose the fair value of such collateral, and if it has been sold or repledged, whether the entity has an obligation to return it, and the terms and conditions associated with the entity's use of collateral. So, dito po sa collateral po, yung mga amounts po ng financial assets po, kailangan po nila sundin ang terms and condition of the pledge po. Kumbaga po, if the entity holds collateral that is permitted to sell or pledge. So, kumbaga po, kung ano po yung hawak ng amount ng, kunwari po, amount of collateral po, kailangan po nila i-repledge po yun or permitted po yun. Number 7 po, allowance account for credit losses. The carrying amount of financial asset that is mandatorily measured at FVOCI is not reduced by a loss allowance. However, the loss allowance is disclosed in the notes. So, according po dito sa allowance account for credit losses po, kapag ang financial statement ay mandatorily at sa FVOC, hindi po yun mababawas ng loss allowance. Kahit yung loss allowance po ay disclose na po sa notes na po nila. Number 8 po, defaults and breaches. The entity shall disclose any defaults and breaches relating to loans payable, including the carrying amount of those loans payable, the principal, interest, sinking fund, or redemption terms, and whether default was remedied, or terms of the loans payable were renegotiated before the financial statements were authorized for issue. So, dito po sa defaults and breaches, yung amount po ay madidisclose po na kahit anong defaults po tsaka breaches niya relating to loans payable na under po siya ng the principal, interest, sinking fund, or redemption terms, and whether default was remedied. Yun po. Tapos po, sunod po, statement of comprehensive income. So, under po ng statement of financial position, meron tayong bali 8. Yun po ay carrying amounts of financial assets and financial liabilities. Financial assets and financial liabilities measured at FVPL. Financial assets measured at FVOCI. Reclassification. Offsetting financial assets and financial liabilities. Collateral. Allowance amount for credit losses, defaults, and breaches. So, dito po, wait lang, previous po natin. So, dito po, sa pangalawa na po, yun na po yung statement of comprehensive income. Items of income, expense, gains or losses, an entity shall disclose the following. So, ang mga bagay po ng income, expense, tsaka gains or losses, kailangan po ma-disclose under the following of a net gains or net losses on financial assets and financial liabilities measured at FVPL, showing separately those relating to designated and mandatorily measured at FVL. 2. Financial asset measured at amortized cost. 3. Financial liabilities measured at amortized cost. 4. Financial assets measured at FVOCI, showing separately those related to elected and mandatorily measured FVOC. Tapos po, yung letter B naman po, yung ay ang total interest revenue and total interest expense computed using the effective interest method for financial instruments measured at amortized cost or mandatory FVOCI, showing these amounts of separate. So, sa bawat amounts po na kailangan mo i-compute, yun ay total interest revenue and total interest expense. Using the effective interest method for financial instruments measured at amortized cost. Letter C, fee income and expense. Alam na naman na po natin ang fee income and expense. Yun po ay yung mga amount na kung ano po yung nai-income natin at ano po yung mga nagagastos po natin, yun po ay expense. So, others disclosure po ay fair value. So, fair value, the entity shall disclose the fair value of each class of financial assets and financial liabilities in a way that the fair value can be compared with the carrying amount. However, fair value disclosure is not required when the carrying amount approximates fair value, such as for short-term trade, receivables and payables, and for lease liabilities. So, hindi po nire-required ang fair value ng disclosure kung ang kinikerry niya po na amount ay such as for short-term trade nga po, receivables and payables, and for lease liabilities. Next po, punta po tayo sa nature and extent of risk arising from financial instruments. So, dito po, malalaman po natin kung ano po yung kahalagan po, ano po yung mga risk na pwede may dulot, or ano po yung mga risk na na-arise po dito sa financial instruments po natin. Ayan po. The second category of disclosure required by PFRS 7 is the disclosure of the nature and extent of a risk arising from financial instrument to which the entity is exposed and how the entity manages those risks. PFRS 7 requires the disclosure of the following risks. So, dito po sa second category po natin, malalaman po natin kung paano na i-handle or paano ang PFRS 7 na minamanage ang mga risk na ito. So, punta na po tayo sa number 1, credit risk. Is the credit risk that one party to a financial instrument will cause a financial loss for the other party by failing to discharge an obligation. So, from the credit risk po, dito po na ang isang party daw po ng financial instrument, magkakaroon po siya ng financial cost for sa ibang party po. By what po? By failing to discharge an obligation. Yung pong, kumbaga po, hindi nasusunod po ang mga credits po nila or amounts na kailangan po nila obligahin po. Number 2, liquidity risk. Is the risk that an entity will encounter difficulty in meeting obligations associated with financial liabilities that are settled by delivering cash on other financial assets. So, dito po sa number 2, sa liquidity risk, kung sino man ang nag-encounter na mahirap na meeting or obligations or yung mga hinahawakan po nila, nakasali po ang financial liabilities, yun ay po ang pagsisettle nila ng delivering cash or financial assets po nila. Mga financial assets or yung mga bagay na amounts na ang nahihirapan po sila. Next po. So, yun po. Credit risk and liquidity risk are the opposites. So, magkaparehas lang po sila ang credit risk and liquidity risk. For example po, ang credit risk includes the possibility that an entity cannot collect on his receivables. Hindi nga po kaya kolektahan ang mga amounts na kinikerried mo nila. While Liquidity risk includes the possibility that an entity cannot pay its payables. So, kung sa credit risk, may posibilidad na ang hindi niya po kaya mangolekta ang mga amounts. Ganon din po sa liquidity na hindi niya po kayang bayaran ang mga utang po. As a guide, recall that liquidity is defined in the conceptual framework as the ability of the entity to pay its short-term liabilities. Ay, nahapyawan. Ayun, ay hindi po. Number 3, market risk is the risk that the fair value or future cash flows of a financial instrument will fluctuate because of changes in market prices. Market risk comprising the following three types of risk. So, under po ng market risk, from the word market po, marami na po tayong sa panahon natin ngayon pa sa pagbago-bago ng panahon, sa pagbago-bago ng klima natin ngayon, meron po tayong mga changes. Syempre po, yung mga bagay po, nakasettle po sa kung ano yung klima natin. So, meron po tayong tatlong types of risk under market risk. Number A is currency risk. It's a risk that the fair value of future cash flows of an financial instruments will fluctuate because if changes in foreign exchange rate. So, dito po, as we can see po, dahil nga po pandemic ngayon po, so sobrang hirap po ng buhay. Kaya ang mga foreign exchange rates natin, I mean, yung mga iba po ay tumataas po, yung mga iba po ay bumababa po. Nakadepende po 'yan sa kung ano po ang standard or ano po yung nakikita po natin sa panahon po ngayon. Letter B, interest rate risk is the risk that the fair value or future cash flows of a financial instrument will fluctuate because of changes in market interest rates. So, dito po sa interest rate risk, ang fair value po nila or future cash flows of financial instrument magbabago po dahil po ang mga import and export po nila na mga food, pagkain po or mga bagay po ay magbabago-bago po dahil po sa panahon talaga po ngayon. Magkakaroon po siya ng mataas na ratings or mababa po na ratings, or should I say po mataas na interest po or mababa na interest. Number C, other price risk po. The risk that the fair value or future cash flows of a financial instrument will fluctuate because of changes in market prices. So as we can see dito po sa market po natin, nagkakaroon po talaga ng risk po talaga dahil sa mga produkto po natin. Of course, especially import and export po, magbabago-bago po ang amount po niyan. Lalo na po, kino-considered po nila or ina-apply po nila dito po yung panahon po natin ngayon. Next po, the entity shall provide both qualitative and quantitative disclosure for each type of the foregoing risk. So, dito po, pinoprovide na po nila ang qualitative and quantitative sa iba't ibang foregoing risk po nila. Syempre po, habang ngayon po, pabago-bago din po ang risk na tinatahakan po natin or risk na Next po, examples of qualitative disclosures. A, risk exposure and how they arise. So after meeting other types of risks, hindi natin maiiwasan kung paano din sila ulit umangat or bumaba. Kasi yun nga po, hindi natin po alam kung kailan po talaga siya tataas or bababa po. B, the entity risk management objective policies and process including methods used to measure risk. So dito po, So, ayun po, dun po sa management objective policies and processes, including methods, are used to measure risks. So, dito sa letter C po, any changes in A or B from the previous period. Next, we have example of quantitative disclosure. A summary of qualitative data about the entity's risk exposure at the end of the reporting period. B. Concentration of risk. C. Other relevant disclosure not provided in A and B. Next, disclosure of concentration of credit risk is required of most financial instruments. Disclosure of market risk or price risk is normally required of financial instrument measured at fair value. Disclosure of interest rate risk is normally required of debt instruments with variable interest rates. Disclosure of currency risk is required of financial instrument measured in foreign currency. So, dito po, ang pagsasarado po ng concentration of credit risks ay kailangan po ng financial instruments. Same as disclosure of market risk or price risk, normal din po yan na kailangan po ng financial instruments po natin para ma-measure po nila. Disclosure of interest rates is normally required of debt instruments with variable interest rates, and disclosure of currency risk is required of financial instruments measured in foreign currency. So ayun po, dyan na po natatapos ang aking report. Sir Jeric, sana po maintindihan niyo po. Kabado much po talaga, sir. And thank you once again, sir, for listening my report po. Have a good day po, sir.